my name is Patrick von Arx. I'm an attorney based in Zurich. Today I would like to give you a quick briefing on the enforcement of EU judgments here in Switzerland. The enforcement of an EU judgment, meaning a judgment which was rendered by a court of an EU country, is governed by the Lugano Convention. That's the convention which was entered into between Switzerland on the one hand and the EU on the other hand. This Lugano Convention, it deals with jurisdictional in an international setting, but it also deals with recognition and enforcement of judgments on an international basis. The Lugano Convention does not apply to all sorts of EU judgments. It only applies to judgments which were rendered in a civil matter or in a commercial matter. Meaning, in particular, it does not apply to judgments in bankruptcy matters. So the scope of the applicability is limited. The Lugano Convention applies whenever an EU court has rendered a judgment. It does not matter whether the parties to the court proceedings that ended up in the EU judgment are actually EU citizens as well. So it could even be a Russian citizen litigating against an US citizen in an EU court, and the EU court will render a decision. Even such a decision could basically be enforced here in Switzerland based on the Lugano Convention. The Lugano Convention applies to judgments, meaning to judgments which are issued by a court, but they do also apply to notarial deeds which are issued by a notary in the EU. So let's say if a notary in Frankfurt draws up a notarial deed wherein, let's say, the debtor is ordered to make any payments to the creditor, then the creditor can ask for enforcement and recognition of this notarial deed in Switzerland as well, based on the Lugano Convention. If the claimant asks for the enforcement of a new judgment here in Switzerland, basically, Swiss courts can only reject the enforcement here in Switzerland if there is an issue of violation of public policy. So if the EU judgments violates Swiss public policy. As a second exemption, Swiss courts will only refuse to enforce the EU judgment here in Switzerland if the debtor can evidence that he has never been properly notified of the initiation of the court proceedings in the EU. Because that's really a key matter of civil procedure, that the defendant must at least have been properly notified of the initiation of proceedings against him. And therefore, Swiss court, they can review if at least he has been properly informed in the EU proceedings. And then the third ground for refusal, that's if another court has already rendered a decision in the same matter. Because Swiss courts, they will not accept enforcement here in Switzerland if another court has already ruled on the same matter. Then it's very important to know that the EU judgment can only be enforced here in Switzerland if the EU judgment would also be enforceable in the EU country where it was rendered. So let's say if it's a German judgment, then under German law it must be enforceable, otherwise it cannot be enforced here in Switzerland. Whenever a Swiss court is asked to enforce an EU judgment here in Switzerland, the Swiss court will verify the formal point which I have just explained. By contrast, the Swiss court will not verify the EU judgment on the merits. So the Swiss court, it does not have the authority to somehow second guess whether the EU court has correctly issued the judgment. That's beyond the authority of the Swiss court. The Swiss court will just check the formal points, and if they're okay, then the Swiss court will proceed to the enforcement of the EU judgment here in Switzerland. The process to have the EU judgment enforced here in Switzerland, it's quite straightforward. The claimant just files the request here with the competent court in Switzerland. He provides the Swiss court either with the original of the EU judgment or with a certified copy of it, and the claimant must properly explain why the judgment can be enforced in Switzerland. In particular, the claimant must also explain that the EU judgment is enforceable in the EU country. To provide evidence to the Swiss court, it's the easiest approach is to provide the Swiss court with this form number 5, which is set out by the Lugano Convention. That's a special form which is issued by the EU court, where the court states that the EU judgment is already enforceable. But even if the Swiss claimant cannot provide this form to the Swiss court, he can nevertheless proceed with the request. He just needs to explain to the Swiss court that under the foreign laws, the EU judgment is already enforceable. Then, once this request has been filed, it will be up to the defendant to provide his possible counter-arguments, meaning that there are some grounds for refusal not to declare the judgment enforceable here in Switzerland. And then the court will issue the order. Normally there will not be any oral hearings, rather the whole process here in Switzerland will be conducted by just exchanging the parties' briefs. I hope this quick video has been helpful to you. See you next time. Goodbye.